Again, looking at social and behavioral research that is attendant with, supportive of, could bollocks up biomedical technologies, but very important to look at that. And then a whole burgeoning field around information technologies, new social media that can be both fomenters of epidemics if people are hooking up a lot more, but can, through these media and access to more potential sex partners on quicker bases, like, what's that thing called? Grindr. Do you have Grindr up here? Yeah. Okay, those who know, know. And the ways in which those technologies can be used as prevention venues or risk reduction venues. So a lot more work on that. And of course, the ever popular implementation and effectiveness research, really trying to spend more energy looking at what actually works and why and how, and particularly as research-derived interventions or programs are implemented at community, what is necessary to make them work and sustain them, and who can do that. So that whole national strategy framework plan is, I think, a very important context for how we think about what to prioritize in social research, and is certainly driving how we're thinking in the US. The other one that's affecting us very directly, I think you were smarter, you have more rigorous banking laws. I guess I should be careful what I say because this is being recorded, but, and so you're not suffering in quite the same way as we are in the States, but we have had some horrific budget times. And there have been a number of analyses based on various proposals that have floated in the Congress, our Meshuggah Congress, that's a technical term, that could be one proposal that has floated for the coming fiscal year or two is to reduce funding levels to what they were in fiscal year 2008. And this is, AMFAR did a nice analysis of what the impact of that would be for the US domestic and global response. We have a terrific deficit, as you know, and there's a freeze on federal spending. We have major budget shortfalls in the states, like mine, California, which is really quite appalling. And that's resulting in reductions for HIV prevention in public health departments, who are the primary funders and supporters of HIV prevention services in the states. You can see 50% of reported budget cuts, the amount, the scope of those cuts. People are being laid off, so you have less capacity, and a lot of community-based organizations are closing shop. Large organizations like mine are being asked to absorb the programs or the people, and that gets into some really funky community dynamics that you might imagine. And we have the AIDS Drug Assistance Program, which is supposed to be a program of last resort that provides funding for people to access AIDS medications if they can't otherwise afford them through their insurance or other mechanisms. And the people who are on waiting lists to have access to that program, the number is growing every month. We're up to over 7,000 people now. So we're seeing all of this as a result of the budget crunch, and it's affecting research as well. And this just shows you what in the global scene can be kind of an astounding or embarrassing, depending on your sense of things, amount of money that the United States gets to spend on research and on AIDS research. It's really phenomenal. We have a $30 billion budget at the National Institutes of Health altogether. 10% or so of that is AIDS research, believe it or not. So we're talking about $3 billion US. But that's been somewhat stagnant over the past few years. We had a time between 1998 and 2003 that the Congress doubled the NIH budget, and you could see the AIDS research funding inclined during that period. But now things are pretty stagnant, so it's getting very competitive. Fewer grants are being funded. And that creates some havoc and a need to prioritize as well. How am I doing on time?
That's great. Just we've got at least another 15 minutes.
Oh, goody. So one of the other things that very much affects what we do in social science, again, mostly in the US context, but you've had your versions too, is some politicization of science or the politics of science. And we really had it in spades during the Bush administration in particular, but we've had it historically from the earliest years of the epidemic when researchers were trying to do surveys, national surveys of adult and adolescent sexual behavior, and the government, after peer review, and in one case even after partial funding had been released, the administration, this was Bush Sr., put the kibosh on those studies and they were not allowed to go forward, based on the fact that we were going to ask people about their sexual behaviors. And then in recent years, we've had attacks from conservative, mostly Christian religious organizations in cahoots with members of Congress and the past administration that identified a couple hundred U.S. and other investigators funded by the NIH and their grants and tried to get them unfunded. Again, peer-reviewed, approved projects that they didn't like because they talked about sex and drugs and abortion and family planning and gay people and injectors and so on. So there was just a real assault on science during those years. I don't know if you can read this cartoon. Can you see it? Yeah, so you get the idea here. And it's very much related to the budget cuts. You know, we have to have enough money for science so that we have something that we can attack and politicize. And that may have been then, but it still goes on. Every year when the Congress, the U.S. Congress is appropriating money for the programs of the federal government, somebody, some member of Congress or a few, propose to eliminate funding for very specific grants. And, you know, the NIH funds 8,000, 10,000 grants. I mean, huge number of grants. But they seem to go through and somebody does a keyword search and they find a few grants that they just think are silly and will, you know, if you put them out in the public, are going to sound silly to the average American. And they try to get them defunded. So this was a list of those that were proposed for defunding in the most recent round. That was the funding resolution to maintain the government for a short time. And I highlighted the one that's obviously AIDS related, but there are others as well. And, you know, it does get a chuckle. Study the impact of integral yoga on hot flashes in menopausal women. Well, if you're a menopausal woman, it ain't that funky. And, you know, maybe there's some really important research there. But these, you know, they're the ones that sound either silly or that are about things that the conservatives who are trying to unfund them feel strongly about. So this goes on every year, and every year we have to deal with trying to save these poor studies. Now, the one example that I think we all know from Canada has to do with more of a case of when the science isn't enough. And we've had that for years in the States around needle exchange as a harm reduction strategy, where the evidence has been unassailable, really, even though there have been attempts to assail it, about the efficacy of expanded syringe access through needle exchange and pharmacy access and things on reducing HIV infections among drug users and their partners. Well, you have Insight in Vancouver, the supervised injection facility, and, you know, as much evidence as that project has accrued and amassed around its efficacy and effectiveness, not just for HIV prevention, there are still attacks and assaults and the lack of recognition of that evidence, correct? Right. So we all have some version of that. So that's, I wanted to not end on too sad a note, but just to say that if you look at the 30-year history of the response to HIV and AIDS and the role, excuse me, I know that's not going to look good on the tape, but I'm back. And the role of social research and what we've endured, what we've contributed, you can see that the research has made terrific contributions. There's still some very exciting directions in which we are moving. We have a lot to contribute to our own disciplines, but also to the broader discourse and this whole notion of combination approaches. But we also are always mindful that that research is taking place in context that is very much affected by tightening budgets and by political forces that are beyond our control, and by the politics of science that many of us play in and many of us try to stay out of. So the more things change, the more they sometimes remain the same, or versions of the same things, that we're a little bit still the underdog sciences in the scientific arena and in the public. So we have to constantly bang our head against the wall and put up a fight for ourselves. But we also have an opportunity. I think that the budget cuts and the national strategies as a frame really are going to help us all, if we're willing to do it, which I think we have to be as scientists or advocates, say what are the most important and things that have the greatest impact that we should be doing and can be doing, and let's stop doing the things that really are not efficacious but just keep us safe and funded and happy with our little programs. So I think it's an opportunity as much as it's a scary time. And the really important thing for us as social scientists, we tend to get very righteous. We think what we do is self-evidently important, but we have to be really rigorous. So with that, I'd like to end and thank a few people who are noted here on the slide. And thank you for your attention, and thank you for inviting me here.